Gambia stands at the brink after a December election defeat. President Jammeh at first graciously conceded to his rival Adama Barrow, only to take back the concession while digging in his heels to remain in power. With a 90-day state of emergency now in place and Jammeh set to stay in power for that duration, West African countries say they may act militarily to restore democracy. In a sign of how dismal the situation has become, Barrow is sworn in, not in Gambia itself, but in his country's embassy in Senegal. In this edition of the debate with me, Waqar Rizvi, we seek to understand what is behind this crisis and how external players are influencing the Gambia's politics. Our guests for this debate are editor at Pan-African Newswire, Mr. Abayomi Azikiwe, who is joining us live from Detroit. And we're also joined by African policy analyst, Mr. Nia Kwede, who is joining us live from Washington. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Kwede, I'll start with you. What do you make of President Jammeh's refusal to give up power despite a defeat in the elections, which in fact he had initially accepted?
I think his position is appalling. And by the way, I think we have to go by what the Gambian constitution says. His mandate ended this past midnight in Banjul. So he is correctly identified as the former president. Yes, the parliament said that they have extended his term for 3 months, but the Gambian parliament, according to the constitution, has no power to extend the mandate of the president. His mandate ended, and the embassy of Gambia in Dakar, like every embassy, every legitimate embassy, is the soil of the country, and therefore President Barrow, that is his proper designation, he was sworn in about 2 hours, an hour and a half ago. So what we have now is the real president of Gambia is in the embassy in Dakar, and the former president, who is claiming that he is the president, is not. And his actions are terrible. It's going to bring violence if he doesn't change his mind. We have seen election-related violence in other African countries, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire come to mind. And so this is why the neighbors have been trying to persuade former President Jammeh to leave office after first coming for 22 years. So his actions are terrible, and if he doesn't change his mind, it will lead to war. As we've said, the West Africans are not behind him, the African Union is not behind him, and the UN Security Council is not behind him. And most important of all, Gambians are not behind him either.
Okay, Mr. Azikiwe, how do you feel about all this? Why do you think President Jammeh changed his mind at the results?
Well, he went on national television in the aftermath of the election results being announced, saying that there were gross irregularities in the process. And this, of course, sparked the intervention of the economic community of West African states who have been trying, they claim, to mediate the conflict. He is still refusing to step down, and at present there are reports that the Senegalese military is amassing at the borders for an intervention. Our concern is that why is there such a hurry for a military intervention inside the country? The British government declared a travel advisory there, where thousands of tourists and other guests are being evacuated from the country. Now, if the situation was so unstable in Gambia, why are there thousands of tourists and guests inside the country who are not leaving or who express no desire to leave prior to this declaration by London? We have to look at the role of the Senegalese military and its relationship to the United States. They just signed a joint defense agreement with the United States in July, making them the closest country in the region to the United States Africa Command. So we believe very strongly that this is a manifestation of the military exercises that have been carried out over the last several years in West Africa, coordinated by the U.S. Africa Command, and this is making good, or attempting to make good, on those military exercises.
Mr. Akwede, I saw you smiling through Mr. Azikiwe's answers. Go ahead and react. Go ahead.
Yes, because I disagree with so much of it. Number one, first of all, when AFRICOM was started in 2007 by former President Bush, I have written essays. I am an African. I have written essays why we don't need AFRICOM based in Africa. Right now, it is not based there, number one. Number two, this whole idea is being led by the West Africans. The current chairperson of ECOWAS is President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, my former boss. She has led the delegation. You know, Mr. Azikiwe said that there is intervention. The intervention has not been military. 4 presidents, and Ghana's former president had joined them. He stepped down peacefully. They have been to Banjul many times trying to get Mr. Jammeh, the former president, to leave. His term expired last night, as I said. The idea that this is being coordinated or being done at the behest of AFRICOM, to me, holds no validity. But of course, if Mr. Azikiwe is going to make a charge like that, he has to produce the evidence. This is being done by West Africans and by the African Union, and the idea that they cannot do anything unless the U.S. orders them, I'm afraid, is an insult to Africans.
Mr. Okwede, if I could just continue with you for a moment. Mr. Azikiwe had made another point as well, that it is kind of suspicious. Why should we move towards military or a talk of military intervention so quickly in this game? That is, isn't it?
Yes. Well, if you believe the word quickly, I do not, because let me say again, the president of Nigeria, the president of Senegal, the president of Liberia, who is the chair of the ECOWAS, and the former president of Ghana, they have made at least 4 trips to Banjul to talk to Mr. Jammeh. They have done this for the past 5 weeks. They have said to him, your mandate ends on July 18 at midnight. Please, we will help you step down. We will do whatever it takes, but it is important that power be handed over very peacefully. Africa has too long a history of leaders staying in power and coups, and we have moved away from that. The African Union has moved away. ECOWAS has moved away. So let me say again, the intervention has been peaceful. 4 presidents have gone to talk to Mr. Jammeh over and over and over. And by the way, last night, the president of Mauritania also went there with his own plane to try and persuade him to leave after his mandate had ended. He refused. So the person creating all the problems is former President Jammeh, and the intervention so far has been peaceful.
Okay.
It hasn't been quick. Now, if the military force is moving, they will have to be ordered by the valid president, who is now Mr. Barrow.
Okay, let me just get Mr. Azikiwe's response to all of what you've said. Mr. Azikiwe, go ahead.
Well, the fact that Mr. Barrow had to be sworn in the Gambian embassy in another country, Dakar, which has military forces on its border, is a clear indication of the degree of support that he has inside the country. And if you talk about the role of various governments in West Africa, for example, Liberia, it owes its existence to an ECOWAS intervention in 2003. We all know about the close links between the United States military and Liberia. There's no secret about this. These joint military operations are conducted annually. They're publicized by the United States Pentagon through their websites, through the AFRICOM websites, through the U.S. Army Africa websites. There's no concealed information in this regard. And we always have to take into consideration the role of Britain, the role of the United States, and the role of the European Union in Africa. We cannot ignore this, because they are the ones who train and supply resources to many of these military forces throughout the region. So to disregard the role of the former colonial powers, the dominant neo-colonial power now in the world being the United States, the Obama administration's enhancement of the United States Africa Command is clearly flawed in any political analysis of what's going on right now in West Africa. We've seen in Cote d'Ivoire what happened 6 years ago with the ouster of President Laurent Gbagbo, him being deported to the Netherlands to stand trial just because there was a dispute over an election. I mean, many countries have disputes over electoral processes. These should be worked out through negotiations and through diplomacy. The fact that you had thousands upon thousands of British citizens and U.S. citizens in Gambia who are only being evacuated now as a result of the British Foreign Office's executive order that came down over the last several days.
Okay, so Mr. Azikiwe, I just wanted to ask you, just for clarity's sake, I will get to you, Mr. Okwede. Mr. Azikiwe, I wanted to stick with you just for a moment. Sure. President Jammeh seems not to be taking helpful steps. You know, he initially accepted, as we said, the results of this election. Then he said, you know, there were irregularities. The Election Commission, to an extent, admitted some irregularities, but said didn't change the result. How do you see his specific role in all this?
This is up to the Gambian people themselves to resolve. The Parliament, in a measure, extended his government by 3 months. This is being totally disregarded. And we have to look at the forces that are behind this call for such a rapid military intervention in Gambia. As I mentioned, in Cote d'Ivoire, look at the situation now. We just had a mutiny in recent weeks by rebel soldiers who were mobilized by French imperialist interests in 2011, who in fact overthrew a government, a legitimate government in Abidjan, and now we have mutinies inside the country. You have wealth that is being stolen from the people in Ivory Coast. We cannot say that the situation in Ivory Coast is by any means stable. So there's no guarantee that a Senegalese or a Nigerian or some Ghanaian involvement in this intervention is going to bring peace and stability to Gambia. It's a very poor country, a small country. It represents no threat to the other countries in West Africa or to the international situation.
Okay, so Mr. Okwede, I wanted to get your response on two specific points. I'll let you respond. I just want to ask you specifically about, sure, as Mr. Azikiwe there said, we cannot certainly deny past colonial powers' influence in these countries. And secondly, as Mr. Azikiwe there said, certainly an external player's, even neighbors' role within Gambia then reduces the Gambian people's own role, doesn't it? They are the ones who should be deciding how to move ahead.
Yes, if I might start with your second point first. Yes, it's the Gambian people who should decide. That is what democracy is about. But they did decide. The one person who is refusing to accept the decision of the Gambian people is former President Jammeh. Let's get that straight. He did come out and say he accepted the election results. I noticed that Mr. Azikiwe skipped that part. President Jammeh, when the election results came, accepted it, congratulated President-elect Barrow, and said, you will be running the country. Then later, he made allegations, but listen, the time for accepting or rejecting elections is finite. You cannot come back then and say, oh, I changed my mind, I no longer accepted it. Now, also, when we say that Gambia doesn't pose a threat to its neighbors, and in a large sense, no. But please remember that a big chunk of Gambians are so bothered by what their president, former president, is doing that they have fled the country. I noticed that Mr. Azikiwe talked a lot about why are the British tourists being asked to leave. Well, let's focus on the fact that 26,000 Gambians have gone into Senegal, so that when there is instability, when there is bad government by a president in his country, it destabilizes the whole area. So they are already pouring into the neighboring country of Senegal. That's one of the points. Now, the fact that practically every African country is a former colony, that doesn't mean that the independence is meaningless. And I have to say again that I noticed that Mr. Azikiwe has talked a lot about Cote d'Ivoire. When I got the call, we weren't going to talk about Cote d'Ivoire, but I will invite you to do another program on Cote d'Ivoire because I lived in Cote d'Ivoire. I was there when a lot of these things happened, and it was an election dispute that Mr. Gbagbo lost, and he started a war in order to stay in power, even though he had won earlier election for 5 years, and he was granted 5 additional years without elections so that he can we can have good elections. So we must not skip on the facts. I am African. I know those facts. The fact that some people sit here and want to say that every time something they don't like goes wrong in Africa, it has to be blamed on the United States or Britain because they are imperialists. Some people might believe it. I'm African. I study these issues. I teach them at the university. And I say, if you make an allegation, you must have logic and you must have evidence. And I don't see any of that.
Okay, so Mr. Azikiwe, you know, as Mr. Akwete there said, is it a judgment, do you think, on President Jammeh that so many people have left Gambia, have fled Gambia to Senegal?
Not about President Jammeh. This is about outside interference in a sovereign African state by a regional institution that is guided, that is funded, whose military are trained by imperialist states. 86% of the external trade on the part of Gambia is done with Britain and the European Union states. They're in a position to strangle the country economically, already a poor country. So if we ignore that, then we cannot have an adequate assessment about developments that are taking place today in West Africa. It's very clear that the United States is involved in massive military interventions all across Africa. They have a base in Djibouti, although my colleague said that the AFRICOM base is in Stuttgart, Germany, but they have a huge military base in Djibouti at Camp Le Monnaie. This base has been strengthened and enhanced under the current outgoing administration of President Barack Obama. It's very clear that the United States is threatened by the growing relationship between African Union member states and the People's Republic of China, along with Iran, Turkey, Japan, and other states, which are offering much more cooperative agreements, economic agreements, than the United States and Britain. What has the United States and Britain actually done for West Africa during the post-colonial period? Today, we're seeing the reemergence of a new, renewed African debt crisis. And this is very, very important for us to take into consideration when we look at developments in Cote d'Ivoire, in Gambia, and other states throughout the region.
Okay, so Mr. Akwete, I wanted to get, and we're running out of time quickly here, but I just want to get your reaction to this economic issue, because, you know, it does make sense, doesn't it, that the United States would not want BRICS nations or the other nations that Mr. Azikiwe there mentioned to get a foothold in Africa. It's not in the U.S. interest to do that, would it?
Well, first of all, China already has strong economic relations with African countries. I don't see I live in Washington. I watch Africa very closely. I am an African. And in fact, you know, African countries, yes, have established relations, economic relations with China. But that has not caused the U.S. I mean, think about it. We are saying that the United States is going to use its army to overthrow governments in order to roll back China's economic relations with African countries. Frankly, that does not make any sense to me at all. Remember that the Chinese adopted capitalism in 1985 after Chairman Mao had died. The Americans have been practicing capitalism for much longer. Their economy is much longer, bigger. They have had longer relations. If it is, I mean, you cannot on the one hand say that the Chinese, because they have made inroads economically, they are good guys, but if the French have relations with African countries, they are stealing the wealth. We have to use one standard, and I don't frankly think if you are going to argue that the Americans are going to overthrow African leaders because they have relations with economic
Okay, Mr. Akwete, I do apologize for interrupting. I hate to do this, but I just want to give the final word to Mr. Azikiwe. Mr. Azikiwe, we have a minute left. Go ahead.
Well, there's a laundry list of governments that have been destabilized and overthrown by the United States. We could talk about Ghana. We could talk about Congo. There are so many. And they are today undermining and destabilizing governments throughout the African continent. And China is not an imperialist country. It's still a socialist country, so you cannot evaluate their relationships with African states or states in Asia or Latin America with that of the former colonial and continuing neo-colonial and imperial powers.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there at that, but we'll try to continue this conversation with the both of you at another date as well. We appreciate, of course, your contributions to the discussion. That was editor of Pan-African Newswire, Mr. Abayomi Ezekiel, who was speaking to us live from Detroit. And we were also joined by African policy analyst, Mr. Nia Kwede, who had been speaking to us live from Washington. And, of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.